Gather round now, chillin'. Come close to this old fire that flickers like the spirits of our people. I got a tale needs tellin', a memory that burns hotter than the Mississippi sun, darker than the belly of them slave ships that crossed the cursed waters. This here's the story of Sarah du POÇO, Sarah of the Well, a woman who got buried alive in the red clay earth of Louisiana for 40 days and 40 nights, and rose up breathing fire and vengeance. They tried to break her spirit in that dry hole, but what they didn't know was this. You can chain a body, whip a back, sell a child, but the soul? Lord have mercy. The soul got roots deeper than any well-master Beaumont could ever dig. So hush now, and listen. 'Cause what I'm about to tell you ain't just history, it's blood testimony, passed down from them who survived to tell it. Now listen here, child, 'cause this tale begins way back in them days of deep sorrow, when the cotton ruled and the whip spoke louder than any preacher's sermon. Sarah, she wasn't born with that name du POÇO yet, no sir. Back then she was just little Sarah, daughter of Ruth, woman of the quarters who carried Africa in her voice like honey mixed with tears. Sarah first drew breath on the Beaumont plantation round about 1815, when Louisiana was still young and cruel as a copperhead snake. Her mama Ruth, now, she was one of them strong-backed women who'd survived the Middle Passage. Crossed that terrible water in chains so tight they left permanent marks like devil's bracelets on her wrists. Ruth used to sing in the dead of night, old songs in a tongue Sarah couldn't quite catch but felt deep in her bones, songs that made the ancestors lean close to listen. "Mama," Sarah would whisper, curled up on the dirt floor of their cabin. "What them words mean?" "Hush now, baby," Ruth would say, stroking Sarah's thick hair with calloused fingers. "Them's the words of home. Them's the words they can't steal, can't sell, can't whip out of us. Long as we remember, we ain't truly lost." The quarters, Lord have mercy, they was a pitiful sight. Rows of wood plank shacks leaning like drunken men, gaps in the walls wide enough for winter wind to cut through like a knife. Families packed in tight, sometimes 8 or 10 souls to a space no bigger than a horse stall. At night you could hear everything, babies crying, old folks moaning with the rheumatism, young couples sneak in moments of tenderness in the dark, and always, always the sound of somebody praying low and desperate. Sarah grew up knowing the rhythm of bondage like other chillin' no-nursery rhymes. Up before dawn, the horn blowing harsh across the fields. Cornmeal mush for breakfast, maybe a bit of fatback if you was lucky. Then out to them endless rows of cotton, white as innocence but heavy with sin. Pick until your fingers bled and your back screamed for mercy that never came. She was just 10 years old, 10, when she felt the lash for the first time. The overseer, a red-faced devil named Clemens with breath that smelled like rotten whiskey, caught her stopping to help her little brother Josiah when he stumbled under the weight of his cotton sack. "Gal, you got time to play nursemaid?" he snarled, and before she could speak, the whip sang through the air. It cut across her shoulders like fire, and Sarah bit her lip so hard she tasted copper, determined not to give him the satisfaction of her tears. That night, Mama Ruth washed the blood from Sarah's back with water boiled with comfrey and plantain, old remedies passed down from the root doctors. "You gonna carry scars now, baby," Ruth said, her voice thick with grief. "But scars is just proof you survived. Don't you forget that." Sarah's brother Josiah, he was different from her, all quiet rage and clenched fists. Where Sarah learned to heal and soothe, Josiah learned to watch, to remember every cruelty, storing up anger like kindling for a fire that would one day burn. He was 2 years older, strong as iron, with eyes that saw too much too young. Then there was little Lila, Sarah's niece, born to her sister who died birthing her. Lila had her mama's sweet face and a laugh that could brighten even the darkest day in them quarters. Sarah loved that child fierce like she was her own, bringing her wildflowers from the edge of the woods, teaching her songs, promising her things she couldn't promise. "One day, Lila girl, one day you gonna be free." And there was Nate. Sweet Jesus, Nate. The blacksmith's apprentice with hands like carved mahogany and a smile that made Sarah's heart do things she didn't quite understand at first. He was older by 5 years, serious-minded, with a gift for working iron that even Master Beaumont grudgingly respected. In them days, blacksmiths had a bit more freedom. Master needed his tools mended, his horses shoed, his wagon wheels fixed. So Nate could move about the plantation with a little less watching, and he used them moments to catch Sarah's eye across the yard, to brush her hand when he passed her a dipper of water, to whisper promises in the shadows behind the smokehouse. "Sarah," he told her one night, both of them stealing time under the magnolia tree that grew twisted and ancient near the quarters, "I'm gonna buy our freedom. Gonna save every penny they let me earn. Gonna petition the master, gonna—" "Hush, Nate," she said, pressing her fingers to his lips. "Don't go making promises you can't keep. Just love me now, here, in this moment. That's freedom enough." But in her heart, she knew better. There was no freedom on the Beaumont plantation. There was only survival, resistance in small ways, a tool accidentally broken, work done just slow enough to frustrate but not enough to earn the whip, herbs slipped into the master's food to give him stomach troubles, songs sung in the fields that carried coded messages about routes north and safe houses. The Beaumont plantation itself was a kingdom of cruelty built on blood-soaked ground. Master Elijah Beaumont. Now there was a name that still makes my skin crawl chillin'. He was third-generation slave owner, inherited his daddy's land and his daddy's meanness, multiplied both tenfold. Tall, thin like a scarecrow, with pale eyes that looked at human beings like they was livestock to be calculated and used up. He'd ride through the fields on his black stallion, fancy clothes never touched by the dirt that caked on the slaves, watching everything with them cold eyes. Beaumont had bought Sarah's family at auction in New Orleans when she was just 5, stood there on the block while white men poked and prodded, looked at teeth like they was buying horses, debated the breeding potential of the women like they was discussing cattle. Now the Beaumont place sprawled across more acres than a soul could walk in a day. Cotton fields stretching to the horizon, rice paddies in the low-lying areas where mosquitoes bred thick as sin, tobacco in the eastern sections. The big house stood proud on a rise, white columns gleaming like false promises, while all around the quarters sagged in their misery. Beyond the fields, the swamps whispered secrets, dark waters, cypress trees hung with Spanish moss, like the ghosts of the hanged, gators lurking in the murk. Folks said that's where the Maroons lived, the ones who'd escaped and never been caught, building free communities deep in places white men feared to go. Sarah used to dream about them swamps, wonder if she could make it, if Nate and Josiah and little Lila could all slip away one night and disappear into that wet darkness. But it was just dreaming. The paddy rollers rode every night, white men with dogs and guns licensed to kill any Negro found without a pass. The Fugitive Slave Act meant even if you made it north, you could be dragged back in chains. Freedom was a ghost most folks never caught. Sarah learned early to keep her head down but her spirit up. Mama Ruth taught her the old ways, how to read signs in nature, which herbs would heal and which would harm, how to pray to the God of the Christians and the gods of Africa in the same breath. By the time Sarah was 15, folks in the quarters called her when they was sick, when babies wouldn't come right, when somebody needed a rootwork bag for protection or luck. She became known for her healing hands, her knowledge of conjure and medicine both. Old Doc Matthias, the plantation's white doctor who barely bothered with slave ailments, once saw her treating a child's fever with willow bark tea and bone set, and he grunted, "Gal's got more sense than half the quacks I studied with." But sense didn't make her free. The quarters had their own rhythms, their own secret life. Every Sunday, if Master was in a mood, there'd be a brief respite, a few hours where families could gather, where the preacher, a slave named Brother Solomon who'd somehow learned to read the Bible, would lead service in the praise house, a rickety building that leaned heavy to one side. But the real church, chillin', that happened in the hush harbors, deep in the woods where white folks couldn't hear. Sarah went there with Mama Ruth, with Josiah and Nate, with other folks who needed to praise God in their own way, to sing spirituals that carried double meanings, to pray for deliverance that felt more real than any promise from a white preacher's lips. It was in them hush harbors that Sarah felt most alive, most connected to something bigger than the plantation, bigger than bondage. The old ones would speak of ancestors watching from beyond, of spirits in the trees and water, of the day when Pharaoh's army would drown and the people would be free. "Keep your lamps trimmed and burning," they'd sing, voices rising in the dark. "Keep your lamps trimmed and burning, the time is drawing nigh." Years passed like molasses, slow and sticky with suffering. Sarah grew from girl to woman, and with that came new dangers. She noticed Beaumont's eyes lingering on her when she passed the big house, noticed the way he'd call her up sometimes to serve at table when guests came, just so he could watch her move. It made her skin crawl, made her want to scrub herself raw. "Be careful, sister," Josiah warned her one evening, voice low and urgent. "That man got plans for you and ain't none of 'em good. I seen how he looks." "I can handle myself," Sarah said, but her heart was heavy with knowing. She'd heard the stories. Slave women taken by masters, bodies used and discarded, babies born light-skinned and sold away, families shattered. It was a particular kind of bondage, that threat always hanging over your head. Then came the day that changed everything. It was autumn 1835, and the cotton harvest was in full force. The plantation was busy with activity. Buyers coming to inspect the crop, traders bringing new slaves to auction. Master Beaumont had invited neighbors and business associates for a week of festivities, showing off his wealth like a peacock spreading poisoned feathers. Sarah was 15 years old, standing in the yard helping prepare food for the gathering, when she heard the sound of hoofbeats and the rattle of chains. A coffle of slaves was arriving. Men, women, children shackled together, walking that terrible march from the auction blocks of New Orleans. She stopped, her hands frozen over the basin where she was washing greens, and watched. The faces of the enslaved were landscapes of despair, some angry, some broken, some just empty. Children clung to their mamas, old folks stumbled in their chains, and the trader cracked his whip just to hear it sing. Master Beaumont rode up on his black stallion, and Sarah saw him clearly in that moment. Saw the devil in fine clothes, saw the man who held the power of life and death over her people, saw her own future written in his cold, calculating gaze. He dismounted, walked along the line of shackled souls, inspecting his potential purchases. Then he looked up, and his eyes locked on Sarah. For a long, terrible moment, their gazes held. Sarah felt ice run through her veins. There was something in his look that went beyond the usual master's appraisal. There was hunger, possession, a promise of attention she didn't want. He smiled, slow and cruel. "That one," he said to his overseer Clemens, pointing at a strong-looking man in the coffle. "And that woman there, but mainly..." His eyes slid back to Sarah, still standing frozen in the yard. "Mainly I'm pleased with the stock I already got. Real pleased." His voice carried across the yard, and Sarah felt every eye turn toward her. Mama Ruth's hand flew to her mouth. Nate, working at the forge nearby, dropped his hammer with a clang. Josiah's face went stone, and in that moment, Sarah understood. The hunter had marked his prey. The shadow of the master's desire had fallen across her path, and there would be no easy escape. That night in the quarters, nobody slept easy. Mama Ruth held Sarah tight, rocking her like she was still a child. "We gotta be smart now, baby. We gotta be clever. That man dangerous, and he got the law on his side." "I won't," Sarah whispered fiercely. "Whatever he wants, I won't. I'll die first." "Don't talk like that," Ruth said, but her voice was hollow, 'cause she knew as well as anyone that death might be the kindest fate available. Nate came in the darkness, slipping through the shadows to Sarah's cabin door. "We could run," he said urgently. "Tonight. I know the paths through the swamp. I know folks who'd help." Sarah looked at him, at his beautiful, desperate face, and felt her heart breaking. And leave Josiah? Leave Mama Ruth and little Lila? They'd be punished for our escape. You know how it works, Nate. Everybody pays when somebody runs. He knew she was right, but the helplessness in his eyes was worse than any whip. In the weeks that followed, Sarah walked careful as a cat on a fence rail, avoiding the big house, keeping to the fields and the quarters, praying to every god and spirit she knew. But she could feel Beaumont's attention like a weight, pressing down, waiting for the right moment. The other slaves watched, worried. They'd seen this before. Masters taking what they wanted, slave women with no power to refuse, the babies that came light-skinned and unloved, sold away so white wives wouldn't be reminded of their husbands' sins. But Sarah was different. She had fire in her, same fire that burned in Mama Ruth, same fire that ran back through generations of women who'd survived the Middle Passage, survived bondage, survived everything that was meant to break them. And that fire was about to be tested in ways nobody could imagine. One evening, as the sun bled red across the horizon like an omen, Master Elijah Beaumont rode past where Sarah was working in the garden behind the quarters. He reined in his horse, looked down at her, and said words that would seal both their fates. "That one got spirit," he muttered to Clemens, who rode beside him, but loud enough for Sarah to hear. "We'll see how long it lasts." And Sarah, who'd been taught since birth to keep her eyes down, to say yes, massa, and no, massa, who knew the price of defiance was death or worse. Sarah looked up. She looked Master Beaumont straight in his cold eyes, and though she said nothing, her gaze spoke volumes. It said, "You can own my body, but you'll never own my soul." It said, "I am not afraid of you." It said, "I am Sarah, daughter of Ruth, granddaughter of Africa, and I will not break." Beaumont's face went hard as stone, his jaw clenched, and in that moment war was declared, a war that would end with one of them in the ground and the other transformed by fire. The old folks say that when two souls lock in battle, the ancestors lean close to watch. That night, every elder in the quarters felt it, a shift in the air, a heaviness that spoke of coming storms. Brother Solomon prayed till dawn. The root doctor, old Mama Dessa, burned protective herbs and muttered warnings. But Sarah lay awake on her pallet, staring at the ceiling where spiders wove their webs, and she knew with terrible certainty that her life was about to change. She just didn't know how deep into the earth she'd have to go before she could rise again. And that, chillin', is how it all started, with a look, a promise, and the gathering of dark clouds over the Beaumont plantation. But this was just the beginning. The worst was yet to come, and Sarah's true test was waiting in a hole in the ground, 40 days deep and darker than any night she'd ever known. Now you see, people, after that day when Sarah locked eyes with Master Beaumont, life on the plantation got heavy as chains, thick as swamp water in August. The tension hung over the quarters like storm clouds that wouldn't break, and folks walked careful, speaking in whispers, knowing something terrible was brewing. Days turned to weeks, and Beaumont's attention on Sarah grew from a shadow to a presence that followed her everywhere. It started subtle, the way poison starts, a drop at a time till your whole system's infected. He'd call her up to the big house on the smallest pretense. "Need someone to clean the parlor," Clemens would say, but there was already house slaves for that. "Master wants fresh water brought to his study," but he had a whole staff to fetch and carry. Each time, Sarah went with her heart pounding like African drums, knowing these summons meant nothing good. In the big house, she'd feel his eyes on her like spiders crawling across her skin. He never touched, not yet, but the threat was there in every look, every word spoken too soft, every moment he contrived to be alone with her. "You're a smart gal, Sarah," he'd say, leaning back in his chair while she scrubbed floors or dusted shelves. "Not like the others. You got something special. I could make your life easier, you know. Move you to the house permanently, lighter work, better food. All you got to do is be grateful." His voice dripped with implications, and Sarah would keep her eyes down, scrubbing harder, her jaw clenched so tight it ached. "I'm content in the quarters, massa," she'd say, voice flat as a pressed coin. "Content?" He'd laugh, but there wasn't no humor in it. "You don't even know what content means, gal. But you will. I'll teach you." Every time she left that house, she felt dirty, like she needed to scrub her skin raw. Mama Ruth would see it in her eyes, would hold her and rock her and whisper prayers in that old tongue, asking the ancestors for protection. The other slaves knew what was happening. Ain't no secrets in the quarters. Everybody's business is everybody's burden. The women looked at Sarah with pity and fear, knowing they'd been there or could be there tomorrow. The men, Lord have mercy, the men looked away, heavy with the shame of their powerlessness, knowing they couldn't protect their women without signing their own death warrants. Nate took it hardest. He'd wait for Sarah when she returned from the big house, searching her face for signs of violation. His hands curled into fists like he wanted to strike something but had nowhere to aim his rage. Did he? Nate would start, but Sarah would shake her head. Not yet, but it's coming, Nate. I feel it coming like I can feel rain in my bones. We could kill him, Nate whispered one night, so low even the crickets couldn't hear. They was hiding behind the smokehouse, stealing moments in the dark. Poison in his food, an accident with a horse, make it look like natural causes. And hang for it? Sarah touched his face, memorizing every line. They'd know, Nate. They always know. And even if they didn't know for sure, they'd hang somebody just to make a point. Probably half the men in the quarters. You think I could live with that blood on my hands? Josiah had different ideas. He'd started attending the Hush Harbor meetings more regular, listening to the old ones talk about Denmark Vesey's planned uprising down in Charleston years back, about Nat Turner's rebellion in Virginia. He had that look in his eyes, that dangerous gleam that spoke of a man weighing his life against his rage and finding rage heavier. There's more of us than them, he'd mutter, pacing the cabin like a caged animal. If we all rose up at once, we'd die, Mama Ruth said firmly. All of us. You think they ain't prepared for that? You think every white man in Louisiana wouldn't ride down here with their guns and their dogs and their ropes? They'd make examples of us that'd echo for generations. So we just submit? Josiah's voice cracked with anguish. Watch while they take Sarah. Watch while they do whatever they want. And we just bow our heads and say, yes, massa? The silence that followed was thick enough to drown in, 'cause there weren't no good answer to that question. Never has been, never will be. It's the terrible mathematics of bondage. Resist and die or submit and die slowly inside. Meanwhile, Beaumont's patience was wearing thin. He started sending gifts to the quarters for Sarah, a new dress, a pair of shoes, a ribbon for her hair. Each time Sarah refused them, sent them back through Clemens, and each refusal made Beaumont's anger burn hotter. The overseer started watching Sarah extra close in the fields, looking for any excuse to punish her, to break her spirit before Master claimed her body. He'd dock her rations for imagined slowness, assign her the hardest rouse, make her work past dark when others was released. But Sarah endured. She had that strength in her, that iron will passed down from women who'd survived things that should have killed them. She worked till her hands bled, sang spirituals that carried messages of resistance, and every night she'd go to her cabin and pray to every god she knew. The Christian god Brother Solomon preached about, the African gods Mama Ruth whispered of, and the spirits of the ancestors who'd walked this terrible path before her. Give me strength, she'd pray, tears streaming down her face. Give me courage, and if you can't give me freedom, at least give me the power to die with dignity. Little Lila, sweet child, didn't understand all of it, but she knew something was wrong with Aunt Sarah. She'd climb into Sarah's lap in the evenings, wrap her little arms around Sarah's neck and say, "Don't be sad, Auntie. Tomorrow gonna be better." And Sarah would hold her tight, breathe in the smell of her hair, sweet grass and wood smoke, and think, tomorrow ain't never better for folks like us, but I'll be damned if I let this child see me break. The season turned toward summer, and with it came the oppressive heat that made the South feel like God's own punishment. The air hung thick and wet, mosquitoes bred in every puddle, and the cotton grew high and demanding. Folks worked from can't-see morning to can't-see night, sweat pouring off their bodies, overseers pushing harder 'cause the market was good, and Beaumont wanted maximum profit. It was during this time that Beaumont's patience finally snapped. There was a gathering at the big house, planters from 3 parishes coming together to discuss politics and prices, to drink fine whiskey and congratulate themselves on the superiority of their civilization built on our backs. Extra slaves was needed to serve, and Sarah's name was called. She knew before she went that this night would be different. felt it in her bones, saw it in Mama Ruth's eyes when the old woman grabbed her arm and said, "Baby, you keep yourself close to the other house slaves. Don't let him catch you alone." "I'll try, Mama," Sarah said. But they both knew try didn't mean much when the master decided to take what he wanted. The big house was ablaze with candles and lamps, music drifting from the parlor where white folks danced their complicated dances, laughing and lying to each other about honor and grace while their fortunes was built on our blood. Sarah moved through the rooms with other slaves carrying trays of food and drink, keeping her eyes down, trying to be invisible. But Beaumont watched. Every time she entered a room, she felt his gaze like a brand. He was showing off for his guests, playing the benevolent master, speaking of his well-trained and docile slaves. But his eyes on Sarah told a different story. As the night wore on and the white folks got drunker, the atmosphere changed. The music got louder, the laughter more raucous, the comments more crude. One of the planters, a fat man with a cigar clamped in his yellow teeth, grabbed Sarah's wrist as she passed, yanking her close. "No, this one's a fine piece, Beaumont," he slurred, his breath hot and whiskey sour in her face. "You let your guests sample the goods?" Sarah went rigid, every muscle in her body screaming to run or fight. But she stood frozen, knowing either response could mean death. Beaumont stood up from his chair, and for a moment, just a flicker, Sarah thought he might defend her. But his next words killed that hope dead. "That one's spoken for," he said, voice cold. "She just don't know it yet." The room erupted in laughter, crude jokes flying, and Sarah felt something crack inside her chest. The fat man released her wrist and she stumbled back, her vision going gray at the edges. "Keep moving," she told herself. "Just keep moving. Get through this night." But as the party wound down and guests departed, as the other house slaves was dismissed to their quarters, Beaumont called her back. "Sarah, stay." 2 words, just 2 words, but they held the weight of chains, the promise of violation, the end of her autonomy as a human being. The other slaves looked at her with pity and helplessness as they filed out. Old Bessie, the head house slave, whispered as she passed, "Pray, child, pray hard." And then Sarah was alone with Master Elijah Beaumont in his fine parlor, with its imported furniture and paintings of dead white people who'd built their wealth on bodies like hers. He approached her slowly, like a hunter who knows his prey is cornered. He'd removed his jacket, loosened his collar, and there was whiskey on his breath, and something dark in his eyes. "You've been difficult, Sarah," he said, circling her like she was livestock he was evaluating. "All those gifts refused, all those kindnesses rejected. You think you're better than the other gals? You think your virtue makes you special?" Sarah kept her eyes down, her body trembling but her voice steady when she spoke. "I ain't refused nothing that was truly a gift, massa. A gift is something given free with no expectation. What you been offering ain't gifts at all." His hand cracked across her face so fast she didn't see it coming, and she tasted blood where her tooth cut the inside of her cheek. The pain bloomed hot and immediate, but Sarah didn't cry out. She wouldn't give him that. "You need to learn your place," Beaumont hissed, grabbing her chin and forcing her to look at him. "Your property, gal. My property. I can do whatever I want with you, whenever I want. The law says so. God says so. You understand me?" Sarah looked into his eyes, those cold, dead eyes, and something in her snapped. Not broke, no. Snapped like a twig turned into a whip. All the fear, all the rage, all the accumulated grief of her people across centuries, it all came flooding up from some deep well inside her. "The law is wrong," she said, her voice low but clear as a bell. "God don't say that. You just a man and you gonna die like a man, and when you do, you gonna answer for every sin you committed against my people." For a moment, Beaumont looked shocked. Slaves didn't talk back. Slaves didn't prophesy their master's judgment. The social order that kept him in power depended on fear and submission, and Sarah had just shattered both. Then his face twisted with rage, and he lunged for her. What happened next unfolded like a nightmare in slow motion. Beaumont grabbed at her dress, tearing fabric. Sarah fought back, not careful, not strategic, just pure animal survival. She scratched at his face, drawing blood. She bit his hand when he tried to cover her mouth, bit down hard till she felt his flesh tear. She screamed, loud and piercing, though she knew nobody would come, knew nobody could help. They fell to the floor, Beaumont cursing and trying to subdue her, Sarah fighting like a cornered wildcat. She grabbed a brass candlestick from a side table and swung it, connecting with his temple. He bled, staggered, and in that moment of freedom, Sarah ran. She ran through the big house, past gasping house slaves who'd heard the commotion, down the back stairs, out into the night air that felt like salvation itself. Behind her, she could hear Beaumont roaring, hear him yelling for the overseer, for the dogs, for the patty rollers. "Bring her back, alive! I want her alive!" Sarah ran toward the quarters, her breath coming in sobs, her body shaken with adrenaline and terror. She'd fought back. She'd drawn her master's blood. She'd committed the unforgivable sin of resistance, and there was no going back from that. Nate met her at the edge of the quarters, his face white with fear when he saw the state she was in. Dress torn, blood on her mouth, wild-eyed and trembling. "What happened? Sarah, what did you do?" "I fought him," she gasped out. "He tried to, and I fought back, Nate. I couldn't just let him." Around them, the quarters came alive with urgent whispers. Everyone knew what this meant. A slave who struck a master, especially in defense of her body, was as good as dead, maybe worse than dead. Mama Ruth emerged from her cabin, took one look at Sarah, and pulled her inside. Josiah was there, and little Lila waking up confused, and they all knew, all of them, that everything had changed. "We could hide her," Nate said desperately. "In the swamp, with the Maroons. They'd punish everyone," Mama Ruth said, her voice heavy with terrible knowing. "Every man in the quarters, maybe every child too. They'd make an example that'd echo for miles. So what do we do?" Sarah's voice came out small, childlike. All the fight had drained from her, leaving only cold understanding of what awaited. Outside they could hear it. Dogs barking, horses stamping, Beaumont's voice raised in fury. The patty rollers was coming, and there was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. Mama Ruth held Sarah close, rocking her like she was still a baby. "You did right, child. You fought for your dignity, your humanity. Whatever comes next, you remember that. You are not property. You are a child of God, a daughter of Africa, and you are loved." The door burst open. Clemens stood there with two other overseers, all of them armed. "Master wants her. Now." Sarah stood up, squeezed Mama Ruth's hand one last time, and walked out into the night. As they dragged her toward the big house, she looked back once at the quarters, at Nate standing helpless with tears streaming down his face, at Josiah held back by older men who knew he'd die if he intervened, at little Lila crying in Mama Ruth's arms. This is goodbye, she thought. One way or another, I ain't coming back from this the same. Beaumont was waiting in the yard, his face bandaged where she'd scratched him, murder in his eyes. The gathered slaves, those forced to witness, stood silent, heads bowed, praying. "You think you can fight me?" Beaumont snarled, circling her like a predator. "You think you got rights? I'm gonna teach you a lesson that'll echo through every slave quarter in Louisiana. You'll beg for death before I'm done with you." Sarah raised her head, looked him in the eye one last time, and said with all the dignity she could muster, "You can break my body, but my soul belongs to God and the ancestors. You'll never own that." Beaumont smiled then, a smile that made her blood run cold, 'cause she realized he'd already decided her punishment, and it was gonna be worse than the whip, worse than the auction block, worse than anything she'd imagined. "I know just the place for a rebellious gal like you," he said softly. "There's an old dry well on the eastern edge of the plantation. Been there since my grandfather's time. Folks used to dump things in it they wanted to forget. And that's exactly where you're going, Sarah. Down in that hole where nobody'll hear you scream, where the darkness will teach you submission, where you'll learn what happens to slaves who forget their place." Around them, slaves gasped. Even the overseers looked uncomfortable. Being buried alive, it was a punishment spoken of in whispers, a cruelty that haunted nightmares, reserved for the most extreme cases of rebellion. 40 days, Beaumont continued, his voice carrying across the silent yard. 40 days and 40 nights, just like Jesus in the wilderness. But you ain't Jesus, gal. You ain't gonna find salvation down there. You gonna find despair. And when I finally pull you out, if you're still alive, you'll be grateful for whatever mercy I choose to show you. Sarah's knees went weak, but she didn't fall. She wouldn't fall in front of him, wouldn't give him that satisfaction. But inside, terror clawed at her chest like a living thing, 'cause she knew, everyone knew, that this was a death sentence dressed up as punishment. "Take her," Beaumont commanded. "Lock her down in that hole, and if anyone tries to help her, they'll join her." As they dragged her away toward the eastern fields, Sarah saw the last glimpse of everything she loved, the quarters where she'd grown up, the faces of her people etched with grief and helplessness. Mama Ruth on her knees praying, Nate with his fists clenched and tears streaming, little Lila not understanding why Auntie was being taken away. And above it all, the moon hung full and red in the sky, like the heavens themselves was weeping blood. "This is how I die," Sarah thought as they pulled her toward that dark hole in the ground. "This is how my story ends, buried alive like so many dreams, so many hopes, so many of my people already swallowed by this cursed earth." But deep inside, in a place even Beaumont's cruelty couldn't reach, a spark remained. A promise made by the ancestors, whispered in the old tongue. "Endure, daughter. Survive. The fire that lives in you cannot be buried. One day, it will rise. And when it does, it will burn everything that tried to kill it." That, chillin', was the night Sarah's real test began. Not the test of her body, which she knew would suffer, but the test of her spirit, her will to survive, her refusal to let bondage have the final word. And as they lowered her into that dark hole and slammed the lid shut, as darkness swallowed her whole, Sarah whispered one last prayer. "Ancestors, walk with me, 'cause I'm about to walk through the valley of the shadow of death, and I need to know I ain't alone. Listen here, chillin', 'cause what happened next is the kind of cruelty that makes the angels weep and the demons smile." Dawn broke red over the Beaumont plantation, and with it came the summons. Every slave, from the oldest to the youngest who could walk, was ordered to gather at the barn. The horn blew harsh and long, and folks stumbled from their cabins with dread heavy in their hearts, knowing this wasn't no ordinary gathering. The barn loomed like a cathedral of sin, its doors thrown wide to reveal the darkness inside. Overseers lined the path, whips coiled at their belts like sleeping snakes, faces hard as granite. The paddy rollers sat on their horses, rifles across their saddles, dogs panting and slavering, eager for blood. This was theater, you understand. Punishment as spectacle, designed to break spirits and remind every enslaved soul of their powerlessness. Sarah stood in the center of it all, hands bound with rough rope that cut into her wrists. They'd kept her in the smokehouse overnight, locked in with the hanging meat and the flies, given her no water, no rest, just darkness and the knowledge of what awaited. Her dress was still torn from the struggle, dried blood crusted at the corner of her mouth, but her eyes, Lord have mercy, her eyes still burned with that fire that wouldn't die. Mama Ruth was held back by two field hands who loved her enough to keep her from rushing forward and sharing Sarah's fate. The old woman's keenan cut through the morning air like a knife, ancient words of grief that echoed back to Africa itself. Little Lila clung to Josiah's leg, her face buried in his worn trousers. Too scared to look, but too young to understand why everyone was so afraid. Nate stood stone still, his blacksmith's hands clenched so tight the knuckles went white as bone. His jaw worked like he was chewing on words he couldn't speak, prayers or curses or promises of vengeance. Didn't matter which, 'cause all of them was equally powerless in this moment. Master Elijah Beaumont emerged from the big house like Judgment Day personified, dressed in his finest clothes despite the early hour. The scratches Sarah had left on his face was bandaged, but not hidden. He wore them like badges of dishonor, proof of her rebellion that needed public answering. Behind him walked Clemens the overseer, carrying a whip that had tasted too much of our people's blood. and Brother Thomas, the white preacher from town, brought in to give God's blessing to the devil's work. "Gather close," Beaumont's voice rang out across the yard. "I want every Negro on this plantation to witness what happens to those who forget their place, who dare raise a hand against their master, who confuse Christian kindness with weakness." Christian kindness. Sweet Jesus. The blasphemy of them words made the very air feel poisoned. The slaves shuffled closer, forced into a semicircle around Sarah. Old folks who'd seen too many horrors, young ones about to have their innocence murdered, mothers holding babies who'd grow up with this memory branded in their minds. Everyone knew what this was, a lesson written in pain, a sermon preached in suffering. "This gal," Beaumont continued, circling Sarah like a carrion bird, "this Sarah has committed the gravest of sins. When I showed her favor, offered her opportunities for advancement, she repaid me with violence. She scratched my face, bit my hand, struck me with a weapon. Such rebellion cannot stand. The social order that protects all of us, white and colored alike, depends on respect for authority. Protect us, Lord, the lies white folks could tell themselves while looking in a mirror." Brother Thomas stepped forward then, Bible clutched in his soft white hands that had never picked cotton or felt the lash. "The Apostle Paul teaches us," he intoned, voice sonorous with false piety, "Slaves, obey your earthly masters with fear and trembling. This woman has violated God's own commandment. Her punishment is not cruelty, it is divine correction." In the crowd, old Brother Solomon, our real preacher, the one who led services in the hush harbors, flinched like he'd been struck. His lips moved in silent prayer, maybe begging God to forgive this misuse of Scripture, this twisting of the gospel to justify bondage. "The punishment," Beaumont announced, letting the words hang in the air like nooses, "is 40 days and 40 nights of isolation and reflection. There is an old well on the eastern edge of this plantation, dug deep but long dry. Sarah will be lowered into it and sealed there, with only the minimum sustenance to keep her alive. When she emerges, if she emerges, she will have learned submission. And if she doesn't survive—" He paused, letting the implications settle like ash. "Then let it be a warning to all who might follow her path of rebellion." The gasp that went through the crowd was like wind through dead leaves. Folks knew about that well. It was a cursed place, haunted by the spirits of things buried and forgotten, a hole in the ground that led straight to hell itself. To be sealed in there, in total darkness for 40 days, that weren't punishment, that was torture designed to break the mind before it killed the body. Mama Ruth broke free then, threw herself at Beaumont's feet. "Please, Massa, please. She young, she foolish, but she learn. Don't do this. Take me instead. I'm old, I lived my life, but she—" Clemens backhanded her across the face, sent her sprawling in the dirt. Josiah surged forward with a roar of rage, but 4 overseers grabbed him, wrestled him down, a rifle barrel pressed to his temple. "Anyone who interferes," Beaumont said coldly, "will join her in that well. Anyone who attempts rescue will be sold south, separated from their families forever. Anyone who speaks against this judgment will taste the whip. Is that understood?" Silence. The terrible, crushing silence of powerlessness, of people forced to watch evil unfold and do nothing to stop it. Sarah looked at her mama in the dirt, at Josiah held down like an animal, at Nate with tears streaming down his beautiful face, at little Lila who'd finally looked up and was staring with eyes too big, too traumatized, too young to carry such horror. And something shifted in Sarah's expression. Not surrender, never that, but a kind of acceptance, a decision made. "It's all right," she said, her voice surprisingly steady, carrying across the yard. "It's all right, Mama. This ain't the end. Whatever they do to this body, they can't touch what's inside. The ancestors walk with me. God walks with me. And you." She looked at her people, her kin, her community. "You remember me. You tell my story. Don't let them bury it along with me." "Enough," Beaumont snapped. "Take her to the well, now." They dragged her through the fields, A procession of misery followed at a distance by the enslaved, forced to witness but forbidden to help. The eastern edge of the plantation was wild, where cultivation gave way to scrub and red clay earth scarred by erosion. And there it was, the old well, maybe 10 feet across, boarded over with weathered planks that hadn't been moved in years. The overseers pulled the boards away, revealing a mouth of darkness that seemed to breathe cold air like the earth itself was exhaling. They'd prepared a rope and a wooden board to lower her on, and a heavy iron grate to seal the top. A grate with gaps too small to climb through but wide enough to let in air and rain, just enough to keep her alive for the duration of her sentence. Sarah looked down into that darkness, and for the first time, fear truly gripped her. Not fear of pain, she'd known pain. Not fear of death, she'd made peace with that possibility. But fear of the darkness, the isolation, the slow erosion of sanity that 40 days of sensory deprivation would bring. Fear of becoming something less than human down there, of forgetting who she was. "Any last words?" Beaumont asked, mocking. Sarah turned to face her people one last time. She saw Mama Ruth supported by neighbors, face wet with tears. Saw Josiah with murder in his eyes and helplessness in his posture. Saw Nate mouth the words, "I love you." Saw little Lila's confused, frightened face. "I am Sarah," she said loud and clear. "Daughter of Ruth, granddaughter of the stolen ones who crossed the water. I am not property. I am not defeated. And when I rise from this pit, and I will rise, I'll be stronger than iron, fiercer than fire. Remember that, all of you, remember that." Then they lowered her down. The rope played out slowly, Sarah standing on that board as it descended into darkness. Her eyes locked on the circle of sky above that got smaller and smaller. She heard Mama Ruth's wail, heard the collective moan of her people, heard Beaumont's satisfied grunt. The board touched bottom. Sarah stepped off into ankle-deep water that shouldn't have been there. No, not water, something thicker, fouler. The smell hit her like a fist. Decay, mold, death, things that had rotted in this hole for decades. They pulled the rope up, and then came the sound that would haunt her. The scrape and clang of the iron grate being lowered into place, the heavy lock snapping shut. The circle of light dimmed, filtered now through metal bars, and Sarah tilted her head back to catch that last glimpse of the world above. Beaumont's face appeared at the grate, backlit by morning sun, speaking down to her like God to a sinner. 40 days, Sarah. 40 days to contemplate your sins and learn obedience. When I return, I expect a very different woman to emerge. If you emerge at all." His footsteps retreated. The crowd was forced back to work, their protests dying in their throats. And slowly, gradually, the sounds faded. Voices, footsteps, the distant crack of whips, the rustle of wind through cotton plants, until all that remained was silence. Silence and darkness, and Sarah alone in a hole in the ground with nothing but the beating of her own heart to prove she was still alive. She screamed then, couldn't help it. Screamed until her throat was raw, until her voice echoed back at her from stone walls slick with slime, until the darkness swallowed the sound and gave her nothing in return. When the screaming stopped, Sarah sank down against the curved wall, her legs finally given out. Her hands found the rough stone, fingers tracing the grooves and cracks, searching for something, anything to hold on to besides fear. This is day one, she thought. Day one of 40. I got to survive, got to endure. For Mama, for Josiah and Nate and Lila, for all my people who can't fight back. I got to survive this, and when I do, when I rise up from this grave, I'm gonna make Beaumont wish he'd killed me quick. Above her, at the edge of the well, she didn't know that Nate had returned in the dead of night, that he'd pressed his face to the grate and whispered her name. Didn't know that Mama Ruth had buried protective roots at the four corners of the well, calling on the ancestors for Sarah's preservation. Didn't know that Josiah had sworn an oath, bloody and binding, that if Sarah died in that hole, he'd burn the plantation to the ground. All she knew was darkness. All she knew was the beginning of the longest 40 days any soul should ever have to endure. And that, my people, is where Sarah's true test began, not in the physical suffering, though Lord knows that would come, but in the battle for her mind, her spirit, her very humanity. The question wasn't whether she'd survive. The question was whether she'd survive whole, or whether the darkness would eat her from the inside out, leaving nothing but an empty shell when they finally pulled her up into the light. Now you see, people, there's darkness, and then there's the darkness of that well. A living thing that pressed against Sarah's skin like wet wool, that filled her lungs with each breath, that turned her own heartbeat into thunder in her ears. The first day passed in a blur of panic and prayer, Sarah's mind running wild like a spooked horse, unable to settle, unable to accept the reality of her tomb. Time lost meaning down there. No sun to mark the hours, no rooster crowing to announce dawn, no bell ringing to summon folks to the fields, just endless suffocating dark that made her eyes ache from straining to see anything at all. She'd wave her hand in front of her face and see nothing, touch her own cheek to make sure she still existed, whisper her own name just to hear a voice, even if it was her own. Sarah. I'm Sarah, daughter of Ruth. I'm still here, still alive. The well was maybe 12 feet deep, the walls curved and slick with moisture that seeped from the red clay. The bottom was uneven, littered with debris, broken pottery, rotted wood, and things she couldn't identify in the dark, things that crunched underfoot or squelched wetly when she moved. The smell was unbearable, mold and decay and something ancient and foul, like the earth itself was sick. Insects crawled everywhere. She felt them on her skin constantly. Spiders spinning webs across her face while she slept. Centipedes with their 100 legs tickling across her arms. Beetles and cockroaches scuttling through her hair. At first she'd scream and swat at them, frantic with disgust. By the second day she barely reacted. They were just another torment, just another test. Hunger came quick and vicious. They'd given her nothing before lowering her down. No food, no water, just her body and her torn dress and the darkness. Her stomach cramped something terrible, growling and gnawing at itself like a trapped animal. Her mouth went dry as cotton, tongue swelling, lips cracking and bleeding. On the third day, or what she thought was the third day, counting by the few times weak light filtered through the grate above, she heard a sound. A scraping at the top of the well. Her heart leaped with hope. Rescue. Mercy. Hello, she called up, voice hoarse. Is someone there? A shadow blocked the light. Then came the thud of something hitting the water near her feet. She felt around in the dark, fingers closing on a small cloth bundle. Inside, a piece of hardtack bread and a tin cup of water. Not enough. Never enough. But enough to keep her alive, which was the whole cruel point. They wanted her to suffer, not die quick and easy. Sarah? The whisper came from above, barely audible. Nate's voice thick with emotion. Sarah, I'm here, baby. Get away from there. An overseer's shout, the crack of a whip. Sarah heard Nate cry out, heard running footsteps, and then silence again. She clutched that bread like it was salvation itself, forced herself to eat it slow, one tiny bite at a time, knowing she couldn't count on another. The water she rationed even more carefully, wetting her lips, taking small sips, making it last. That night, or what might have been night, the hallucinations started. She saw her mama standing in the well with her, singing those old African songs. But when Sarah reached for her, mama dissolved like smoke. She saw the middle passage, saw herself chained in the belly of a slave ship, hundreds of stolen souls packed so tight they couldn't move, breathing each other's dying breaths, and the ocean outside rolling with the bodies of those thrown overboard. No, she whispered, pressing her hands to her temples. Ain't real. Just my mind playing tricks. Stay strong. Stay here. But the visions intensified. She saw auction blocks where babies was ripped from their mama's arms, saw whipping posts where flesh hung in strips, saw the faces of every enslaved person she'd ever known, all of them reaching for her, all of them whispering, "Remember us, tell our stories, don't let us be forgotten." Day 4 brought new torments. Her body, weakened by hunger and dehydration, began to betray her. She soiled herself, unable to hold it, and the shame was almost worse than the physical discomfort. She tried to clean herself with the foul water at the bottom of the well, but it only made things worse. Her skin began to itch and burn, developing rashes in the constant dampness. Her hair, which Mama Ruth had always kept so neat, became a tangled mass of knots and dirt. Lice found her, biting relentlessly. Small cuts and scrapes on her hands and arms from feeling around in the dark became infected, red and hot and throbbing. "I'm gonna die down here," she thought, letting despair wash over her for the first time. "Gonna die in this hole like a forgotten thing, and they'll just board it up again and plant cotton over my grave." But then, on what she counted as the 5th day, something changed. She felt it first as a whisper at the edge of her consciousness, a presence, ancient and familiar. The air in the well shifted, grew somehow warmer despite the cold dampness, and she heard voices, not hallucinatory this time, but real in a way that transcended physical sound. The ancestors. They came to her in the darkness, spirits of those who'd endured the unendurable before her. Great-grandmothers who'd survived the Middle Passage. Grandmothers who'd watched their children sold away. Mothers who'd chosen death over continued bondage. Fathers who'd fought and died for freedom. "Child," they whispered in that old tongue in English, in languages she'd never heard but somehow understood. "Child, you ain't alone. We walked this path. We know this pain, and we survived. You got our blood in your veins, our strength in your bones. Don't you give up now." Sarah wept then, not from despair, but from relief, from the overwhelming comfort of knowing she was connected to something larger than herself, something that slavery couldn't break or bury or destroy. "Help me," she prayed, speaking directly to them. "I'm so scared, so weak, I don't know if I can do this." "You already doing it," they answered. "Every breath you take is resistance. Every moment you survive is victory. The Master put you in the ground, but the ground is where our power lives. The earth remembers every drop of our blood, every tear, every prayer. You standing on sacred ground now, child. Draw strength from it." Sarah placed her palms flat against the clay walls, felt the cool earth beneath her, and something shifted inside her. The well wasn't just a prison, it was a portal, a connection to all those who'd been buried, forgotten, erased from history. Their spirits were here, in the earth, waiting to be remembered. On the 6th day, rain came. She heard it first as a distant patter, then felt it dribbling through the grate above, cold drops hitting her upturned face. Sarah opened her mouth, drank greedily, letting the rain wash away days of accumulated filth. It was a gift, a mercy she hadn't expected, and she laughed, actually laughed at the simple joy of clean water. But the rain brought dangers too. The water level at the bottom of the well began to rise, muddy and cold, creeping up to her ankles, then her calves. Sarah had to stand for hours, legs trembling with exhaustion, afraid of sitting in the rising water, afraid of what might be floating in it. When the rain finally stopped, she was exhausted beyond measure, shivering uncontrollably, her body pushed to limits she didn't know she had. But she'd survived another day, another small victory. On the 7th day, she was sure it was the 7th now, she'd been scratching marks on the wall with a sharp stone she'd found, counting carefully. Sarah made a decision. She would not just survive, she would use this time. Use it to gather strength, to plan, to prepare. Beaumont thought he was breaking her, but he was forging her instead, turning her from flesh into iron, from woman into weapon. She began to explore the well systematically, mapping it with her hands, finding its contours, its weaknesses. She discovered a small depression in one wall where water collected, cleaner than the standing water at the bottom. She found edible roots pushing through cracks in the clay, stringy and bitter but nutritious enough to supplement the meager rations that came sporadically from above. She established a routine: prayer at what she estimated was dawn, exercises to keep her muscles from atrophying, memory work where she'd recite every spiritual she knew, every story Mama Ruth had told her, every piece of knowledge about healing herbs and root work. She would not let her mind decay along with her body, and she began to plan her revenge. 40 days. she whispered to the darkness, to the ancestors, to herself. 40 days to be reborn. Moses spent 40 days on the mountain. Jesus spent 40 days in the desert. I'm gonna spend 40 days in this hell. And when I come out, I'm gonna be something new. Something Master Beaumont never seen before. Something he should fear. Above ground, life continued its cruel rhythm. The cotton grew white and heavy. The overseers cracked their whips. The slaves worked from dawn to dark, but something had changed among them. Sarah's resistance, her punishment, had planted seeds of defiance in hearts that had been too scared to hope. Nate worked his forge with new purpose, secretly shaping tools that could be weapons if needed. Josiah spoke in whispers to other young men about rebellion, about the Underground Railroad, about Nat Turner and Denmark Vesey. Mama Ruth gathered herbs and made charms, sending protection to her daughter through prayers and root work. Little Lila, sweet child, would sneak to the edge of the well at night when no one was watching, would press her face to the grate and whisper, "Auntie Sarah, I brought you flowers. I put 'em here so you can smell 'em. Don't be scared. Don't be sad. I love you." And Sarah, in the depths below, would sometimes hear those whispered words, and they would give her strength beyond measure. 7 days down, she counted on the wall. 33 to go. I can do this. I will do this for Lila, for Mama, for all of us who've been buried alive by this evil system. I will survive. And when I rise with fire. And that, chillin', is how Sarah made it through the first week. Not by becoming less, but by becoming more. The darkness that was meant to destroy her was instead revealing her true strength, her unbreakable spirit. But the worst was still to come. Oh yes, the worst days still waited ahead, when body and mind would be pushed past all human endurance, when death would seem like mercy, and only the thinnest thread of hope would keep her tethered to life. Look here, folk. What happened next in that cursed well goes beyond the suffering of flesh. It enters the realm of spirit, where the veil between this world and the next grows thin as spider silk. Sarah had survived the first 7 days, but now came the middle passage of her ordeal, when hunger and isolation would push her mind to places most souls never go and return from whole. By the 10th day, Sarah's body was wasting away. Her bones pressed sharp against skin that had lost its luster, her muscles weak as wet thread, her eyes sunken deep in their sockets. The meager rations, a scrap of bread here, a cup of water there, was just enough to keep death at bay, but not enough to sustain life proper. She was becoming a ghost while still breathing, a spirit trapped in a failing vessel. But it was in this weakness that the ancestors came stronger. It started one night, or what might have been night time having lost all meaning, when Sarah lay curled on the damp floor, too exhausted even to scratch another mark on the wall. She felt herself drifting, not into sleep, but into something deeper, something that carried her spirit out of that hole while her body remained behind. She found herself standing on a shore, and before her stretched an ocean vast and terrible, its waters dark as old blood. The sky hung heavy with storm clouds that never broke, and on the horizon, she could see the silhouette of a ship, a slave ship, its white sails like grave shrouds against the gray sky. "Child." The voice came from beside her, and Sarah turned to see an old woman, skin like polished ebony, eyes holding the wisdom of ages. She wore the clothes of Africa, bright cloth wrapped around her body, and around her neck hung charms and beads that clicked when she moved. "Who are you?" Sarah asked, though somehow she already knew. "I am a defies," the woman said, and her voice carried the rhythm of drums, the cadence of languages older than America. "I am your great-great-grandmother, stolen from Igboland in my 20th year, brought across these waters in chains. I survived what should have killed me, gave birth to your line in bondage, and died praying for freedom I never saw." Sarah felt tears streaming down her face. "Why am I here? Why are you showing me this?" Adaze pointed to the ship. "Because you need to understand, the hole you in now, that darkness, that suffering, it's nothing new, child. We've been buried alive for generations, in shipholds, in slave quarters, in unmarked graves, but we survived. Our spirits survived, And that same strength that carried us across the water, gonna carry you through these 40 days. The scene shifted like smoke blown by wind. Sarah found herself no longer on the shore but in the belly of that slave ship. The horror of it hit her like a physical blow. Hundreds of African souls packed so tight they couldn't move, chained at the ankles and wrists, lying in their own waste, the air thick with the smell of death and despair. Men, women, children, all stolen, all suffering, all praying in languages the white sailors couldn't understand. She saw a young woman, a defies as she had been, chained beside a girl who couldn't have been more than 12. The girl was dying, could barely draw breath in the suffocating hold, and a defies was singing to her a lullaby from home, trying to ease her passage. That's the power they can never take. A defies' voice echoed through the vision, the power to comfort, to resist through love, to refuse to let our humanity be stripped away. That girl died hearing words of her homeland, died knowing she was loved. That was resistance, child. That was victory in the midst of defeat. Sarah watched as bodies was thrown overboard, as sharks followed the ship like demons attending a funeral, as the survivors sang songs that became the spirituals her own people sang in the quarters. She watched a defies give birth in chains, watched her raise a daughter in bondage, watched her pass down stories and songs and strength that would echo through generations. You carry all of us in you, a defies said as the vision faded. Every ancestor who survived, everyone who died fighting, every mother who lost a child, every father who was sold away. Their strength is your strength. Their resistance is your resistance. Don't you dare give up now. Sarah woke, or returned to consciousness, gasping, clutching at her chest. The well walls pressed in around her again, solid and real, but something had changed. She felt less alone, more connected, like invisible threads tied her to a vast network of souls who'd walked this terrible path before her. Over the next several days, more ancestors came. She met her grandmother Patience, who'd been a conjure woman of great power, who'd used root work to protect the enslaved and hex the masters. Patience taught Sarah songs, taught her how to scratch protective symbols on the well walls with that sharp stone, taught her that earth and water and darkness could be sources of power if you knew how to draw on them. This well is your hush harbor now, Patience whispered, her spirit shimmering in the darkness like heat waves over summer fields. It's your secret church, your place of transformation. Master Beaumont think he punishing you, but he done give you exactly what you need. Solitude to hear the ancestors, darkness to see the spiritual light, suffering to forge your will into iron. Sarah learned to enter trances where physical pain faded and spiritual vision sharpened. She saw glimpses of the future, a burning house, flames licking at white columns, a woman walking away into the swamp with fire reflected in her eyes. She didn't know if it was prophecy or just desperate hope, but she held onto the image like a promise. On what she counted as the 14th day, the hardest vision came. She found herself at an auction block in Charleston, watching as families was torn apart. Mothers screaming as their babies was sold south, husbands shackled and separated from wives, children crying for parents they'd never see again. The horror of it was overwhelming. This was the machinery of slavery laid bare, the cold calculation of human beings treated as commodities. And then she saw herself, or rather, she saw little Lila. Her sweet niece standing on that auction block, barely 8 years old, being inspected by a white trader with dead eyes and tobacco-stained teeth. Sarah tried to scream, tried to run to her, but she was a ghost in this vision, powerless to intervene. "No," she wailed. "Not Lila. Please, not her." The scene dissolved, but the message was clear. This was Beaumont's ultimate threat. If Sarah didn't break, if she survived her punishment still defiant, he would take it out on her family. He would sell Lila, scatter them all to the winds, destroy everything Sarah loved. Sarah came back to her body trembling with rage and fear. She pressed her forehead against the cold clay wall and wept until she had no more tears, until her chest ached from sobbing, until exhaustion pulled her down into fitful sleep. But when she woke, something had crystallized inside her. a decision, a promise. "I'm gonna survive this," she whispered to the darkness, to the ancestors, to herself. "Not just survive. I'm gonna emerge stronger, and then I'm gonna burn it all down." The big house, the whole system of bondage it represents. Every chain and every whip and every master who thinks he owns human souls. I'm gonna burn it to the ground and walk away free, with Lila and Mama and all my people. That's my promise. That's my vow. Witness it, ancestors. Witness it, spirits. I, Sarah, make this blood oath. She bit her own palm, drawing blood, and pressed her hand against the wall, leaving a print that would last long after she was gone. It was a seal, a contract written in pain and determination, a promise that the earth itself would remember. Outside and above, unbeknownst to Sarah, Master Beaumont was celebrating. He'd hosted a dinner party where he boasted to his fellow planters about his innovative punishment, about how he was breaking a rebellious slave without permanent physical damage, teaching her submission through isolation rather than the whip. 40 days in that well, he said, swirling his brandy, and she'll come out a different woman entirely. Docile, grateful, properly trained. It's genius, really. The psychological approach to slave management. The other planters nodded, intrigued, some taking notes. They was always looking for new methods of control, new ways to break spirits while preserving bodies valuable for labor. What they didn't know, what Beaumont couldn't know, was that his genius punishment was having the opposite effect. Instead of breaking Sarah, he was forging her. Instead of crushing her spirit, he was giving it room to grow wild and fierce, fed by ancestral power and righteous fury. In the quarters, resistance was growing too. Josiah had made contact with a conductor on the Underground Railroad, a free black man who posed as a traveling preacher and carried messages between plantations. Plans was being whispered, careful and slow, for a coordinated escape when Sarah emerged. If she emerged. Nate worked late into the nights at his forge, secretly making tools and weapons, preparing for possibilities that terrified and thrilled him in equal measure. Mama Ruth continued her root work, burying protective charms and calling on spirits to guard her daughter and confound her enemies. And little Lila, sweet child, began having dreams. She dreamed of her Auntie Sarah rising from the earth like a warrior, covered in mud and fire, eyes blazing with power. She dreamed of the big house burning, dreams so vivid she woke up smelling smoke. "Mama Ruth," she whispered one night, climbing into the old woman's pallet. "Auntie Sarah's gonna be okay, the spirits told me. She coming back different, but she coming back. And when she do, everything gonna change." Ruth held the child close, wanting to believe, praying it was true. Down in the well, Sarah scratched another mark on the wall. Day 21, halfway through her sentence. Her body was failing, skin and bones held together by will alone, but her spirit blazed brighter than ever. The ancestors walked with her constantly now, teaching her songs of power, showing her visions of what could be, filling her with a strength that transcended the physical. 21 days in the grave, she whispered, her voice hoarse but determined. 19 more to resurrection. And when I rise, Lord have mercy, when I rise, I'm gonna shake the foundations of this cursed place. I'm gonna be the judgment Beaumont never saw coming, the fire he never should have lit. I'm gonna be vengeance in human form, justice wrapped in flesh and mercy for my people who've suffered too long. The ancestors sang approval, their voices weaving through the darkness like threads of light. And Sarah, despite the pain and hunger and weakness, smiled. She had found her purpose in this pit, had discovered a power that bondage could never contain. And that, my people, was the turning point. The moment when victim became avenger, when the buried became the one who would rise, when Sarah transformed from enslaved woman into something new, something fierce, something that would haunt Master Beaumont's nightmares for the rest of his short, cursed life. But the hardest days still waited ahead, and before Sarah could rise, she had to face one final descent into the deepest darkness of all. Listen close now, chillin', 'cause what I'm about to tell you is the darkest part of Sarah's journey. The moment when even the strongest soul faces the tempting whisper of surrender. When death stops being an enemy and starts looking like a friend offering sweet release from unbearable pain. Day 21 arrived like a judgment, and Sarah woke, if you could call that restless unconsciousness sleep, feeling like she was already dead. Her body had wasted to nothing but skin stretched over bones, every rib visible, every joint swollen and aching. Her hair, once thick and beautiful, hung in matted clumps crawling with lice. Sores covered her skin where the constant dampness had eaten away at her flesh, some of them infected and weeping pus. But worse than the physical suffering was the state of her mind. The ancestors had grown quiet. Whether they'd left her or whether she'd lost the ability to hear them, Sarah couldn't tell. The silence was crushing, more terrible than any noise, leaving her alone with her own thoughts that had started to turn dark and twisted, eating themselves like snakes consuming their own tails. "What's the point?" she whispered to the darkness, her voice barely more than a croak. "Even if I survive, what then? Back to bondage? Back to Beaumont's eyes on me, his hands reaching for what ain't his. Back to watching Lila grow up in chains, watching Mama grow old and broken, watching Nate forge iron while his own spirit rusts away." The despair was a living thing crawling through her veins like poison, whispering seductive lies. "You're forgotten. Nobody's coming. Your people have moved on. The world above has continued without you, and when they finally pull your corpse from this hole, they'll toss it in an unmarked grave and forget you ever existed." Sarah's fingers found the sharp stone she'd been using to scratch marks on the wall. She held it, felt its edge, not sharp enough to cut cloth, but sharp enough to open veins if pressed hard enough. The thought came unbidden. One quick slash, pain for a moment, then peace forever. No more hunger, no more darkness, no more waiting for a freedom that'll never come. She pressed the stone against her wrist, felt the point dimple her skin. Above her, filtered through the grate, she could see a sliver of sky, gray with gathering storm clouds, indifferent to her suffering. The world didn't care if she lived or died. Master Beaumont would probably be relieved if she saved him the trouble of figuring out what to do with a slave who'd drawn his blood. "Do it," the darkness whispered. "End this. You've suffered enough. Ain't nobody gonna blame you. Ain't nobody gonna call you weak. You fought hard, but some battles can't be won. Just let go." Sarah's hand trembled. Tears streamed down her face, cutting tracks through the grime. She was so tired, so bone-deep exhausted, not just in body, but in soul. The fight had gone out of her, and what remained was just a hollow shell waiting to crumble. But then, a sound, faint, barely audible, drifting down from the world above. At first, Sarah thought she was hallucinating again, but no, it was real. A voice, a child's voice. "Love you, Auntie Sarah. Don't give up. Please don't give up. Lila." Sweet, innocent Lila, who shouldn't even be near the well, who could be whipped or worse for approaching, had snuck out to whisper her love into the darkness. Sarah's hand froze, the stone still pressed against her wrist but not cutting. She listened, straining to hear more. "Mama Ruth say you strong, say you gonna come back to us. I made you a flower crown, but the guards won't let me give it to you, so I put it at the edge. When you come out, it'll be waiting. Promise me you'll come out, Auntie. Promise." The child's footsteps retreated, probably scared of being caught. And Sarah sat there in the darkness, the stone still in her hand. But something had shifted inside her chest. It was small, just a tiny crack in the wall of despair. But through it flooded memory. She remembered Lila as a baby, barely 3 pounds at birth, everyone saying she wouldn't survive. But Sarah had stayed up nights holding her, keeping her warm, coaxing her to breathe, to fight, to live. And Lila had survived, had grown into that sweet child who just risked punishment to whisper love into a well. "I taught her to fight," Sarah whispered. "I taught her that survival is resistance. How can I give up now? How can I betray that lesson by choosing death when I still got breath in my body?" She dropped the stone. It clattered into the foul water at her feet, sinking into darkness. And Sarah pressed her forehead against the cold clay wall and wept. Not from despair this time, but from something deeper, something that tasted like gratitude and determination mixed together. "I'm sorry, ancestors," she prayed. "I almost gave up, almost let the darkness win. But I'm still here, still breathing, and as long as I got breath, I got fight." As if in answer, the silence broke. Not with voices this time, but with sensation. Sarah felt warmth spreading through her chest, despite the cold dampness, felt strength flowing back into limbs that had been weak as water. It wasn't physical strength, her body was still wasting away, but something more fundamental. Will, purpose. The iron determination of a woman who decided that death would not claim her. Not like this. Not in this hole. She began to move, forcing her protesting muscles to work. She stood, swaying but upright, and pressed her hands flat against the wall. And there, in the darkness, she found something she hadn't noticed before. A thin root pushing through a crack in the clay, pale and seeking water. Sarah broke it off gently, examined it by touch. It was a plant root, maybe from a tree growing above, maybe something that had found its way down through decades of searching. She brought it to her mouth and bit carefully, tasting earth and something faintly sweet. Not much nutrition, but enough. Enough to matter. "Thank you," she whispered, speaking to the earth itself, to the plant that had offered this gift. "Thank you for reminding me that life finds a way, even in the darkest places. Even buried this deep, roots still grow. Seeds still sprout. And if a plant can push through stone to find light, then so can I." She ate the root slowly, chewing each bitter bite, feeling it settle in her empty stomach. It wasn't much, wouldn't keep her alive long term, but it was something. It was the earth itself offering sustenance, refusing to let her starve. That night the dreams came different. Instead of visions of suffering, Sarah dreamed of fire. She saw herself emerging from the well covered in mud like a creature born from clay, eyes blazing with purpose. She walked through the plantation, and wherever her feet touched, flames sprouted. The cotton fields burned. The slave quarters stood untouched, but the big house erupted in an inferno that lit up the night sky like a second sun. In the dream, Master Beaumont ran from the flames, screaming. But Sarah just watched with calm satisfaction as justice consumed everything he'd built on stolen backs and broken spirits. And when the fire died down, leaving only ash and twisted metal, she turned and walked toward the swamp, toward freedom, while behind her the enslaved emerged from their cabins not as property, but as people reclaiming their humanity. Sarah woke from that dream with fire in her veins. The image burned into her mind so vividly it felt less like fantasy and more like prophecy, like the ancestors showing her what could be if she just held on, just survived, just kept breathing. "I see it now," she whispered to the darkness. "I understand. This well ain't my grave. It's my womb. I'm being reborn down here, transformed from who I was into who I need to be. And when I emerge, I won't be the same Sarah who got lowered down. I'll be something new, something dangerous, something free." She scratched another mark on the wall, day 21 complete, and beside it she carved a new symbol, one grandmother Patience had shown her in visions, a spiral representing transformation, death leading to rebirth, the eternal cycle that slavery tried to break but never could. Above ground, unbeknownst to Sarah, Master Beaumont was beginning to worry. 21 days was a long time to keep a valuable slave buried, and he'd started to wonder if maybe he'd miscalculated, pushed too far. He sent Clemens to check the well, to see if Sarah was still alive. The overseer peered down through the grate, called her name. For a long moment, nothing. Then, from the darkness, a voice, weak but unmistakably defiant. "Still here, Clemens. Still breathing. Tell your master I ain't broken yet." The overseer reported back, and Beaumont's face darkened with frustration and something else. The first stirrings of fear, though he wouldn't admit it even to himself. This slave should have been begging for mercy by now, should have been a sobbing wreck. Instead, she sounded almost triumphant. 19 more days, Beaumont muttered. 19 more days. and we'll see how defiant she is when I finally pull her out." But in his gut, he knew something had gone wrong with his plan. He just didn't know what. Couldn't know that instead of breaking a slave, he'd created something far more dangerous. A woman with nothing left to lose, everything to avenge, and the backing of spirits older and stronger than any chains he could forge. And that, my people, is how Sarah survived her darkest moment. Not through her own strength alone, but through the love of a child, the gift of the earth, and the understanding that sometimes you got to descend into hell before you can rise to heaven. The worst was behind her now. What lay ahead was endurance, preparation, and the slow, burning rage that would eventually consume everything Master Beaumont held dear. Now shift your eyes upward with me. Chillin'. 'Cause while Sarah endured her trial in the earth, life above ground moved heavy and slow, like molasses in winter, thick with grief and simmering rage. The plantation kept its rhythms. Cotton picked, tobacco cured, rice harvested from the low fields. But underneath the surface, something was stirring, dangerous as fire catching in dry grass. Mama Ruth aged 10 years in those 3 weeks. Her hair went whiter, her back bent lower, her eyes developed a haunted look that scared the other slaves. Every morning she'd wake before the horn, slip out to the edge of the eastern fields where the well sat like a wound in the earth, and she'd stand there in the pre-dawn darkness praying in that old tongue, calling on gods with names that predated Jesus. "Oya, warrior woman, protect my child," she'd whisper, pouring libations of water on the ground. "Yamoja, mother of waters, sustain her. Shango, god of thunder, give her strength to endure. Ancestors, wrap her in your arms like you wrapped us on the ships, in the fields, in all the dark places we survived." Brother Solomon tried to comfort her with Christian scripture, speaking of Daniel in the lion's den, Shadrach in the furnace, Job's trials. But Ruth would just shake her head. "This ain't about faith in deliverance, brother. This about faith in survival. My baby down there learning things we can't teach her up here. She coming back different, if she coming back at all. I feel it in my bones." Little Lila stopped eating proper. The child would push her cornmeal mush around her bowl, take maybe 2 bites, then just stare off into nothing. At night she'd cry in her sleep, calling for Auntie Sarah, and no amount of comforting could ease her. The other children didn't know how to play with her anymore. Grief had aged her beyond her years, stolen the innocence that slavery hadn't yet crushed. Josiah was a powder keg waiting for a spark. He worked the fields with mechanical precision, his face a mask of stone. But everyone could see the rage building behind his eyes like storm clouds gathering. He'd started attending more meetings in the hush harbor, listening to whispers of rebellion, of coordinated uprisings, of the underground railroad routes that snaked north through the swamps and forests. One night, deep in the woods where white folks feared to go, Josiah met with a man called Moses. Not the biblical one, but a free black conductor who'd made 20 trips south and brought back hundreds to freedom. The man examined Josiah with knowing eyes. "You got the look," Moses said quietly. "The look of a man ready to fight or die trying. But you got to be smart about it, brother. Rage alone won't free your people. It'll just get you killed and make things worse for those left behind." "They buried my sister alive," Josiah's voice cracked with emotion. "Sealed her in the ground like garbage, and we all just stood there and watched. What kind of man does that make me?" "The kind who survived to fight another day," Moses replied. "Listen to me now. I can get you out, get your whole family out. But we got to wait for the right moment, when your sister comes up from that well. If she comes up, that's when we move. The plantation will be distracted, focused on her. That's our window." Josiah wanted to argue, wanted to say they should act now, but he knew Moses was right. Patience was its own kind of resistance, hard as it was to swallow. Meanwhile, Nate was doing his own preparing. At the forge, working metal under Beaumont's watchful eye, he'd started secretly crafting tools that could double as weapons. A hammer weighted just right could crack a skull. A file sharpened on both edges could cut rope or flesh. Iron bars could be bent into hooks for climbing or weapons for fighting. He hid his creations carefully, buried them under the forge's floor, wrapped in oiled cloth to prevent rust. And every night, alone in his cabin, he'd practice movements. How to swing a hammer in combat, how to block and strike, how to move quick and deadly when the moment came. "I'm coming for you, Sarah," he'd whisper into the darkness. "However long it takes, whatever it costs, I'm bringing you out of that hole, and any man stands in my way gonna meet his maker before I do." The other slaves watched all this preparation with a mixture of hope and terror. Some wanted to join the resistance, tired of bowing and scraping, ready to risk death for a taste of freedom. Others were scared, knowing that any uprising would bring terrible retribution, that white folks would rather kill every slave on the plantation than tolerate rebellion. Old Bessie, the head house slave who'd worked in the big house for 40 years, tried to counsel caution. "Y'all young folks think with your hearts," she'd say, her voice tired. "But I seen rebellions before, seen what happens after. They hunt you with dogs, catch you in the swamps, hang you from trees while making your family watch. Is that what you want?" "We already dead, Bessie," one young field hand replied. "We die slow every day in these fields. Maybe better to die quick fighting." Bessie had no answer to that. How could she? They was both right. Rebellion meant death, but so did submission, just slower and more humiliating. Inside the big house, Master Beaumont was growing increasingly agitated. The pleasure he'd taken in Sarah's punishment had curdled into something else. Anxiety, maybe even regret, though he'd never admit it. He'd started having nightmares, dreams where he opened the well and found not a broken slave, but a demon rising from hell, eyes blazing with otherworldly fire. He drank more, snapped at his house slaves, threw lavish parties to distract himself, but found no joy in them. His guests would ask about the famous rebellious slave he'd buried, and he'd laugh it off, but the laughter sounded hollow even to his own ears. His wife, the Mistress Beaumont, a thin woman with a perpetually sour expression, had her own opinions. "You should have just sold that gal," she'd hiss during their arguments. "All this drama over one slave. Now she's become a symbol, something for the others to rally around. You've made her a martyr." "She'll break," Beaumont insisted, but he sounded less certain each time he said it. "When I pull her out on day 40, she'll be properly submissive. You'll see." But at night, alone with his fears, he wondered, what if she dies down there? What if I've created something worse than a rebellious slave, a ghost that'll haunt this plantation forever? The neighboring planters had started talking. Some praised Beaumont's innovative approach to slave management. Others whispered that he'd gone too far, that burying a valuable worker for 40 days was wasteful and possibly dangerous, that it gave slaves ideas about their own power if one woman could survive such punishment. Reverend Thomas, the white preacher who'd blessed Sarah's sentencing, came to visit Beaumont one afternoon. They sat on the veranda, drinking lemonade served by silent house slaves, discussing theology and property management as if they was the same thing. "Elijah," the Reverend said carefully, "I've been praying on this situation with your girl. And I wonder if perhaps we misinterpreted Scripture. Jesus spent 40 days in the wilderness. Yes, but he emerged stronger, more resolved in his mission. What if your punishment, rather than breaking her, is hardening her?" Beaumont waved dismissively. "Nonsense, she's just property, Thomas. A tool that needed correcting. When I pull her out, she'll be properly trained, properly grateful for mercy." But even as he spoke, Beaumont felt the lie of it. Something had gone wrong with his plan, though he couldn't put his finger on what. In the quarters, as days turned to weeks, a strange thing happened. Slaves started singing different songs during work. Old spirituals took on new meanings, codes hidden in plain sight that the white overseers couldn't interpret. "Wade in the water, children, wade in the water," they sang, and white folks heard religious sentiment. But the slaves knew it meant, "Watch for the signal, be ready to run, the conductors are coming. Didn't my Lord deliver Daniel? And why not every man?" They sang, and it became a question, a challenge, a promise that deliverance was possible if they just held on. The work songs grew bolder, the ring shouts in the praise house more fervent, the gatherings in the hush harbor more frequent and more populated. Sarah's suffering had ignited something in her people. Not rebellion yet, but the precursor to it. The kindling that just needed a spark. Mama Ruth continued her root work, creating mojo bags for protection, burying charms at the four corners of the plantation, calling on spirits both African and American. She made a special bag for Sarah, even though her daughter couldn't receive it yet, filling it with High John the Conqueror root, gopher dust from the crossroads, a lock of her own hair, and herbs for strength. "When you rise, baby," she whispered to the bag as if Sarah could hear, "you gonna have the ancestors' power and the earth's blessing. Ain't no master's chains gonna hold you then." 28 days passed, then 30, then 35. The plantation held its breath, waiting for day 40, wondering what would emerge from that well, a broken woman, a corpse, or something else entirely, something that would shake the very foundations of their world. Nate marked the days by scratching lines on the wall of his cabin, each one a prayer, a promise. Josiah made final plans with Moses, ready to move the moment Sarah emerged. Lila kept her flower crown fresh, replacing the wilted blooms with new ones every few days, her child's faith unshakable that Auntie would need them. And in the well, Sarah marked her own count, preparing her body as best she could, strengthening her spirit through prayer and vision, planning her revenge with the cold precision of a conjure woman mixing a deadly root, the collision of above and below, of the waiting living and the enduring buried, was coming to a head. Day 40 approached like destiny, like judgment, like the moment when all accounts would be settled and all debts paid. And that, my people, is how the plantation prepared for Sarah's resurrection. Some with hope, some with fear, some with rage, and Master Beaumont with growing dread that he'd made a terrible mistake. The stage was set, the players ready. All that remained was for the buried woman to rise and for the world above to reckon with what they'd created in the darkness below. Great God Almighty, chillin'. Gather close for this part, 'cause what happened on day 40 was the kind of moment that echoes through history, the kind of thing folks would speak about in whispers for generations, saying, "I was there, I witnessed it with these old eyes." Dawn broke red and angry over the Beaumont plantation, the sky streaked with blood-colored clouds that made even the white folks uneasy. Mama Ruth woke before the horn, felt it in her bones. Today was the day. She dressed in her Sunday clothes, though it wasn't Sunday, and she walked slow and deliberate toward the eastern fields, her feet following a path they'd walked every day for 40 days. Master Beaumont emerged from the big house earlier than usual, dressed formal like he was attending church or court. He'd barely slept, plagued by nightmares where things with Sarah's face but demon eyes crawled from the earth. He wanted this over with, wanted to prove his system worked, wanted to parade a broken slave before his people and restore the order that had felt increasingly fragile. Clemens and 3 other overseers gathered at the well, along with Doc Matthias, who'd been summoned in case a corpse needed certifying. They expected to find a body. If they was honest with themselves, they all expected Sarah to be long dead, that the last 20 days had just been Beaumont's pride refusing to admit failure. Word spread through the quarters faster than fire through dry cotton. They opening the well, they bringing her up. Work stopped. Slaves abandoned their posts, drawn by something they couldn't resist, the need to witness, to know, to see if one of their own had survived the unsurvivable. The overseers tried to stop them, but the crowd was too large, too determined. Even Beaumont, looking at the gathered faces of his slaves, decided to let them watch. Let them see submission enforced, he thought. Let them see what rebellion costs. Nate stood at the front of the crowd, his massive hands clenched, every muscle tense and ready. Josiah was beside him, and between them, Mama Ruth stood like a pillar of stone, her face unreadable, her lips moving in silent prayer. Little Lila clutched her flower crown, her small body trembling with anticipation and fear. The overseers removed the heavy lock, grunting with effort. The iron grate screeched as they lifted it, metal against metal, and everyone fell silent. Even the morning birds seemed to hold their breath. They peered down into that dark mouth, and one of them called out, "Hey, gal, you alive down there?" Nothing. Just darkness and the smell of earth and rot drifting up like the exhalation of a grave. Doc Mathias shook his head. Probably dead. Been too long without proper food or water. Should have pulled her up a week ago. Beaumont's jaw tightened. He'd invested too much in this punishment to have it end in failure. Lower the rope. Bring her up. Dead or alive, I want to see what 40 days has wrought. They lowered the rope with a board attached, same way they'd sent her down. It descended into blackness, swallowed by the earth. They felt it touch bottom, waited for weight, for the tug that would signal they'd secured the body. And then, the rope jerked, hard, like something powerful had grabbed it from below. The overseers stumbled, caught off guard. They braced themselves, began pulling hand over hand, and the rope came up heavy, resisting, like they was hauling up not just a wasted body, but the weight of the earth itself. Slowly, inch by inch, something emerged from that darkness. First, they saw hands, skeletal, caked in mud and filth, gripping the rope with strength that shouldn't exist in a starved body. Then arms, thin as sticks, but corded with desperate muscle. Then a head, face obscured by matted hair and grime, barely recognizable as human. And then she stood on the board, rising from the well like Lazarus from the tomb, like something ancient and terrible being born from clay. Sarah. But not the Sarah who'd been lowered down 40 days ago. The crowd gasped, several people cried out. Mama Ruth's knees buckled, and only Josiah's quick grip kept her from falling. Sarah stood swaying on that board as it rose level with the ground, and when she stepped off onto solid earth, she stood for a moment with her eyes squeezed shut against the light that felt like knives after so long in darkness. She was emaciated, every bone visible under mud-caked skin. Her dress hung in tatters. Her hair was a wild tangle full of God knows what. Sores covered her exposed flesh, and she stank of rot and earth and something else. Something that made the overseers step back instinctively. She stank of power. Slowly, Sarah opened her eyes, and everyone who saw those eyes, slave and master alike, felt something cold slide down their spine. They weren't the eyes of a broken woman. They wasn't even the eyes of the defiant girl who'd fought 40 days ago. These was the eyes of something reborn, something that had walked with spirits and emerged changed, carrying knowledge that living folks shouldn't have. She looked around, squinting in the daylight, and her gaze swept across the gathered crowd. When she found Mama Ruth, something shifted in her expression, a flicker of the Sarah who'd gone down, and she whispered, her voice like gravel grinding, "Mama, I'm home." Ruth broke free from Josiah and rushed forward, but the overseers blocked her. "Stay back. Nobody touches the prisoner till Master says so." Beaumont stepped forward, and there was triumph in his face that couldn't quite hide the unease in his eyes. "Well, well, you survived. I'm impressed, Sarah. Most wouldn't have. You've learned your lesson, I trust. You understand now what happens to slaves who forget their place?" Sarah turned her gaze on him, and Beaumont actually flinched. For a long moment, she just stared, and in the silence you could hear hearts beating, breath catching, the weight of unspoken words pressing down like atmospheric pressure before a storm. Then Sarah smiled. It was a terrible smile, empty of warmth, full of things she'd learned in the dark. "Oh, I learned, Master Beaumont," she said, her voice stronger now, carrying across the field. "I learned more than you could possibly imagine. I learned that there's worse things than death. I learned that darkness ain't empty. It's full of voices, spirits, ancestors who've been waiting a long time for someone strong enough to carry their message. I learned that you can bury a woman, but you can't bury her soul. And most important," she took a step toward him, and he actually backed up, "I learned exactly what I'm gonna do to you." The gathered slaves gasped. The overseers raised their whips. Clemens grabbed Sarah's arm. She was so weak she couldn't resist, and backhanded her across the face, splitting her lip. "Still got that mouth," he snarled. 40 days ain't taught you nothing." But Sarah just laughed, blood running down her chin. She laughed like a woman who'd seen hell and found it less frightening than the world above. The sound of it made everyone uncomfortable, like they was hearing something that shouldn't be laughed at, something dark and knowing and inevitable. "Chain her," Beaumont ordered, his voice sharp with anger that barely masked fear. "Take her to the quarters. Clean her up. We'll deal with further discipline later." As they dragged her away, Sarah kept her eyes on Beaumont, and she said loud enough for everyone to hear, "40 days just like Jesus. And you know what he did after his 40 days? He cast out demons and overturned tables and brought judgment to the wicked. My 40 days is done, Master Beaumont. Now comes the judgment." They hauled her toward the quarters, but she wasn't resisting proper. She was too weak. Yet there was something in her bearing, in the way she held her head up despite the filth and the wounds, that spoke of dignity unbroken, of will undiminished. The crowd parted for her like the Red Sea, and as she passed, slaves reached out, just to touch her, just to brush her arm or her tattered dress like she was something holy, something sanctified by suffering. Mama Ruth finally got to her, wrapped her arms around her daughter's skeletal frame, and both of them wept. "My baby," Ruth sobbed. "My strong, beautiful baby, you survived, you survived." "I did more than survive, Mama," Sarah whispered back. "I was reborn. And the woman who went down in that well ain't the woman who came up. I got plans now. Dark plans, fire plans." Little Lila pushed through the crowd, her flower crown held high. Auntie Sarah, I made this for you. I kept it fresh every day." Sarah looked down at the child, and for the first time since emerging, her expression softened completely. She took the crown with shaking hands and placed it on her filthy head, and the contrast, beautiful flowers against decay and mud, was striking, symbolic, a statement that beauty could survive even in hell. "Thank you, sweet girl," Sarah said, touching Lila's cheek. "This is the most precious thing anyone ever gave me. I'm gonna wear it when I do what needs doing." They brought her to Mama Ruth's cabin and laid her on a pallet. The old women of the quarters gathered, bringing water heated over fires, cloths for washing, healing salves made from roots and herbs. They stripped her carefully, gasping at the state of her body. The sores, the infected wounds, the way her ribs stood out like bars on a cage. But as they washed away the filth, as they tended her wounds and dressed her in clean clothes, they all felt it. She wasn't broken. Damaged? Yes. Weakened? Absolutely. But inside, Sarah burned with something that 40 days of darkness had only intensified. Nate came after dark, slipping into the cabin when the overseers wasn't watching. He knelt beside Sarah's pallet, took her hand, so thin now, bones and skin, and pressed it to his lips. "I thought I'd lost you," he whispered. "I thought—" "You didn't lose me," Sarah said, her voice gentle with him in a way it hadn't been with anyone else. "I'm here, Nate. Changed, but here. And I need you to do something for me. Anything, name it." Sarah's eyes hardened, the softness fleeing. "The house gonna burn, Nate. Soon. And when it does, I need you and Josiah to have everything ready. Food, supplies, weapons. We ain't staying here after we running, all of us." Nate stared at her. "Sarah, you talking about—" "I'm talking about fire and freedom," she said. "I made promises in that hole. To the ancestors, to myself, to every soul that suffered under Beaumont's hand. And I aim to keep them. So you with me or you too scared?" Nate looked at this woman who'd survived the impossible. This woman who'd emerged from the grave with vengeance in her eyes. And he knew. There was no going back now. The die was cast. "I'm with you," he said, "to the end, whatever it brings." And that, chillin', is how Sarah rose from the dead. Not broken, but forged. Not defeated, but transformed. The plantation had tried to bury her alive, but what they'd actually done was give her time to commune with spirits, to gather strength, to plan their downfall. Master Beaumont looked at her and thought he saw a chastened slave. What he should have seen was judgment walking on 2 legs, carrying fire in her belly and righteousness in her bones. The countdown had begun, though he didn't know it yet. His days was numbered, and the numbers was getting mighty small. Listen now, my people, 'cause what I'm about to tell you is the night when heaven's wrath met earth's justice, when a woman rose from her sickbed to become an avenging angel, when the very air itself seemed to hold its breath waiting for the fire that would change everything. 3 days Sarah rested in Mama Ruth's cabin, recovering what little strength her wasted body could muster. The old women of the quarters fed her bone broth and root tea, rubbed healing salves into her infected sores, braided protective charms into her hair. But even as her body mended, slow and painful, her spirit burned hotter, fueled by visions and promises made in the dark. On the third night, storm clouds gathered thick and heavy over the plantation, the kind of storm that makes even brave folks nervous. Thunder rolled like African drums across the sky, and lightning split the darkness in jagged tears. The air hung thick and wet, pressing down on everything, making it hard to breathe. "Tonight," Sarah whispered to Mama Ruth as the old woman tended her wounds. "It has to be tonight." Ruth's hand stilled. She looked at her daughter with eyes that had seen too much suffering, too much loss. "Baby, you barely strong enough to stand. How you gonna—" "The ancestors will carry me," Sarah said, and her voice held that iron certainty that couldn't be argued with. "They didn't bring me through 40 days just to lie here helpless. Tonight the storm gives cover. Tonight while Beaumont sleeps drunk in his fine bed. Tonight while the overseers hide from the rain. Tonight, Mama. It has to be tonight." Josiah and Nate came when darkness fell complete, slipping through the rain-soaked quarters like shadows. They found Sarah standing, barely using the wall for support, but standing nonetheless, dressed in clean clothes, Lila's flower crown still woven into her braided hair despite everything. "You sure about this?" Nate asked, his voice thick with fear and love mixed together. "Sarah, if they catch you—" "They already did their worst," Sarah cut him off. "Buried me alive and I came back. What else they gonna do? Kill me quick? That would be mercy compared to what I already survived." Josiah handed her a small cloth bundle. Inside, a tinderbox, dried moss for kindling, and a small jar of kerosene he'd stolen from the lamp stores. "Moses says he'll be waiting at the old cypress grove by the north swamp. Soon as he sees flames, he moves. He'll get Mama, Lila, and the others who want to run, but Sarah—" He gripped her arm. "You got to make it out too. Don't die for vengeance when you could live for freedom." Sarah touched her brother's face, memorizing it. "I don't plan on dying tonight, brother. I plan on being reborn again, this time in fire instead of earth." The plan was simple in its terrible beauty. Sarah would enter the big house through the kitchen entrance. The lock was broken, Nate had seen to that days ago. She'd make her way upstairs while the house slept, pour the kerosene through the halls and rooms and strike the spark. Then out through the servants' entrance, across the yard to the swamps where Moses waited with boats to carry them deep into the bayou where white men's laws couldn't reach. Mama Ruth made Sarah drink a tea brewed from special roots, for strength, for protection, for the blessing of the spirits. "You carry us all with you tonight," she whispered, pressing a mojo bag into Sarah's hand. "The ancestors walk beside you, Oya rides your shoulders, and my love wraps around you like armor." Little Lila was already asleep, spared the knowledge of what was coming. Sarah kissed her forehead, whispered promises of freedom into her dreams, then turned toward the big house rising white and proud against the storm-dark sky. She moved through the rain like a ghost, pain shooting through her weak legs with every step, but she didn't stop. The storm covered her movements, thunder drowning out footsteps, lightning illuminating her path in brief, stark flashes. She reached the kitchen door, found it unlocked just as Nate promised, and slipped inside. The big house at night was a different creature than during the day. Shadows pooled thick in corners. The portraits of dead Beaumont stared down from walls with accusing eyes. The smell of beeswax candles and tobacco smoke hung heavy, the scent of white folks' comfort built on black folks' suffering. Sarah moved through the darkness with practiced silence, years of serving in this house guiding her steps, even as her body trembled with weakness and fever. She found the lamp oil storage in the butler's pantry, filled her jar, and began her terrible work. She moved room by room, pouring dark liquid over fine furniture, expensive rugs, silk curtains that cost more than a slave's life. The kerosene soaked into wood and fabric, creating trails of potential fire that would race through the house like hungry spirits once lit. In the parlor where Beaumont had tried to force himself on her, Sarah poured extra. In the study where he kept his ledgers documenting human beings as property, she emptied half her jar. In the dining room where white folks had feasted while slaves starved, she created a pool of accelerant that would burn hot and merciless. She was heading upstairs, where Beaumont slept, where she planned to give him the courtesy of a warning before the flames took him, when a floorboard creaked. Sarah froze, listened. Thunder rolled overhead, making the house shudder. Then, footsteps. Someone was awake. A lamp flickered to life at the top of the stairs. Master Beaumont stood there in his nightshirt, looking down at her with eyes that went from confusion to recognition to fury in the span of a heartbeat. "You?" he hissed. "What are you doing in my house, gal? How dare you?" Then he smelled it, the kerosene, saw the jar in her hand. Understanding dawned terrible and complete. "No, no, you wouldn't." "I would," Sarah said, and her voice was calm as deep water, cold as a grave. "I promised I would, Master Beaumont. Down in that hole, in the darkness you put me in, I made a vow, and I keep my promises." He started down the stairs, rage overcoming fear. "I'll kill you, But Sarah was already moving. She struck the tinderbox, flame catching on the dried moss, and she tossed it into the parlor where kerosene pooled thick. The fire caught instantly, roaring to life with a hunger that seemed almost alive, racing along the trails she'd laid throughout the first floor. Beaumont screamed, stumbling back up the stairs as flames filled the hallway below, cutting off his escape. Sarah watched him for one long moment, watched fear replace his arrogance, watched him realize that all his power, all his cruelty, all his belief in his own superiority meant nothing against the judgment of fire. "This is for every back you whipped," she said, her voice carrying over the roar of flames. "For every family you tore apart, for every soul you buried in that well before me, for 40 days of darkness, for every slave who died dreaming of freedom. This is justice, Master Beaumont. This is resurrection." Then she turned and ran, or tried to. Her weak legs buckled and she stumbled, falling hard. The fire was spreading faster than she'd planned, fed by dry wood and expensive furnishings. Smoke filled the air, thick and choking. "Get up," she commanded herself, "get up or die here." But her body wouldn't obey. 40 days of starvation and abuse had taken too much. She'd accomplished her mission. The house was burning, Beaumont trapped. But she couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't. Strong hands grabbed her. Nate, who'd followed despite orders to stay back, who'd watched from outside until he saw she was trapped, who ran into fire for her without hesitation. He scooped her up like she weighed nothing, carried her through smoke and flame toward the servants' entrance. Behind them, they heard Beaumont's screams as the second floor collapsed, as the fire consumed everything he'd built on stolen backs. The sound followed them into the rain-soaked night, a terrible symphony of justice delivered. They ran, Nate carrying Sarah, Josiah appearing from the darkness to guide them, Mama Ruth and Lila waiting at the edge of the fields with Moses and 3 others ready to flee. Behind them, the big house burned like a torch against the storm-dark sky, flames leaping 50 feet high, sparks flying into the night like liberated souls ascending. The alarm bells rang. White folks shouted, but the rain and chaos worked in the escape's favor. By the time anyone organized a response, the little group was deep in the swamp, following Moses through waterways only he knew, leaving bondage behind with every stroke of the oars. Sarah looked back once at the burning plantation, at the destruction she'd wrought, at the symbol of oppression being consumed by righteous fire, and she smiled, a real smile this time, full of something that might have been joy if joy wasn't such a complicated thing for folks who'd survived what she'd survived. "It's done," she whispered to the ancestors, to the spirits, to herself. "It's done, and I'm free. We're all free." And that, chillin', is how Sarah became Sarah de Poço de Fogo, Sarah of the well and fire. How she rose from burial to become an avenging angel. How she proved that even the deepest darkness can't contain a spirit determined to burn bright. But the story ain't quite over yet. There's one more chapter to tell, one more piece of her legacy that needs speaking into the light. Come close one last time, my people, as I tell you the final chapter of Sarah's journey. Not her ending, no, but her true beginning. Her emergence not just from the well or the flames, but into a life that was finally, blessedly, her own. The swamp swallowed them whole that night, the bayou wrapping around the fleeing souls like a mother's protective arms. Cypress trees rose like sentinels from black water, Spanish moss hanging like the beards of ancient prophets, and somewhere in that wet darkness, freedom waited patient and sure. Moses guided them deep, deeper than patrollers would dare follow, through channels that twisted and turned till even Sarah, fevered and half-conscious in Nate's arms, lost all sense of direction. They weren't alone out there in that wilderness. The swamp had always been refuge for runaways, for maroons who'd built communities in places white folks feared to go, and as dawn broke gray and weary, they found one. It was a settlement of perhaps 30 souls, built on raised platforms above the water, hidden so well you could pass within 20 feet and never know it was there. Escaped slaves from a dozen plantations, men and women who'd chosen death in the swamp over life in chains, and who'd found instead a third option, survival on their own terms. An old woman met them at the settlement's edge, her face weathered by years of freedom hard-won. She looked at Sarah, burned, wasted, barely alive, and nodded like she'd been expecting her. "The fire woman," she said simply. "The spirits told us you was coming. Said you walked with the ancestors. Said you been buried and rose again. Come, child, let us tend you proper." They laid Sarah in a shelter, clean and dry, surrounded by the sounds of free black folks living their lives. Children laughing, someone singing while they worked, the splash of fish being caught for supper. It was a sound Sarah had never heard before in all her days. Her people at peace, her people unafraid. She slept for 3 days, healing sleep watched over by conjure women who knew herbs the plantation doctors never learned, who whispered prayers in languages that predated slavery, who saw in Sarah something special, something marked by destiny. When she finally woke, truly woke, she found Mama Ruth sitting beside her, braiding sweetgrass into protective charms. The old woman looked up, and her face cracked into the first real smile Sarah had seen since childhood. "There you are, baby. Thought you might sleep forever after everything. Where?" Sarah's voice came out rusty, unused. "Where are we?" "Free," Mama Ruth said simply. "We're free, child. All of us. Josiah, Nate, little Lila, and 7 others who ran when they saw the flames. Moses got us out clean. The patrollers searched for days but never found this place. And now," she squeezed Sarah's hand, "now we get to live." Over the following weeks, as Sarah's strength slowly returned, she learned the rhythms of freedom. It was strange at first, unsettling even. Waking without the horn, working because you chose to not because the whip demanded it, keeping what you grew or caught or made instead of watching it all go to a master's table. Little Lila bloomed like a flower finally given sunlight. The haunted look left her eyes, replaced by the natural joy of childhood that slavery had tried to steal. She learned to fish, to weave baskets, to sing songs that wasn't coded messages, but just songs for the sake of singing. Josiah worked with the settlement's hunters, learning to move silent through the swamp, to read signs in mud and water, to be a protector for his people in ways slavery never allowed. The rage that had consumed him began to transform into purpose, directed now not toward vengeance, but toward preservation, toward keeping this pocket of freedom safe. Nate built a small forge, and the sound of his hammer on iron became a song of creation instead of bondage. He made tools for the settlement, fixed what broke, crafted hooks and spear points, and eventually, when Sarah was finally strong enough, a simple ring beaten from a nail, offered with hands that shook and a heart that hoped. "I know we can't have a proper wedding," he said, kneeling in the mud before her. "Can't have a preacher or papers or any of that. But we're free now, Sarah. Free to choose, free to love without asking permission. Will you choose me? Will you let me choose you, every day for the rest of our lives?" Sarah looked at this man who'd run into fire for her, who'd waited 40 days, who'd never once questioned her visions or her vengeance, who'd simply loved her through everything. And she said yes. They married in the maroon way, jumping over a broom woven from swamp grass, hands tied with cloth, promises made before the community and the spirits and no white authority needed or wanted. It wasn't recognized by the laws of men, but it was sealed by something older and stronger. Love freely given, vows freely chosen, two souls binding themselves by choice, not chains. Months passed, then a year. News filtered into the swamp from the outside world. The Beaumont plantation had burned to ash. Master Beaumont dead in the flames, the property sold to pay debts, the remaining slaves scattered to other plantations. Some whispered about the fire woman, the one who'd survived burial and returned with divine wrath. The story grew in the telling, becoming legend, becoming myth. Sarah heard these tales and smiled. Let them talk, let them wonder. Let every slave on every plantation hear the story and know resistance is possible, survival is possible, freedom is possible. She became a teacher in the settlement, teaching children to read using a Bible Moses had brought, teaching women the healing arts Mama Ruth passed down, teaching everyone who'd listen about the importance of remembering where they came from, remembering those still in chains, remembering that their freedom was bought with blood and courage and should never be taken lightly. One evening, as the sun set red over the bayou, Sarah sat with old Mama Ruth watching Lila play with other children, watching Nate return from hunting with Josiah, watching the community she'd helped build simply by surviving, by refusing to be broken, by choosing life over death even in the darkest pit. "You did good, baby," Ruth said quietly. "Your suffering wasn't for nothing. Look what it birthed. Not just your own freedom, but freedom for all of us here. You carried us out on your back, carried us through fire." "No, Mama," Sarah said, taking the old woman's hand. "The ancestors carried us. I was just the vessel, the tool they used. Every woman who survived the Middle Passage, every man who endured the lash and kept his dignity, every child sold away who still remembered love, they all carried us. I just listened to their voices in the dark and did what they showed me needed doing." Ruth nodded, understanding. "The spirits are strong in you, child, stronger than I ever seen. One day when I'm gone and you're the elder, you're gonna pass these stories down. You're gonna tell the young ones about bondage so they remember, so they know what we survived, so they understand that freedom this precious can never be surrendered." And Sarah promised she would, promised to be the keeper of memory, the teller of truths, the living testament to survival and resistance. Years later, how many, Sarah couldn't say, time moved different in freedom. She stood at the edge of the settlement with a group of young folks who'd been born free in the swamp, who'd never known slavery's chains but needed to understand what their parents and grandparents had endured. She led them to a tree at the boundary, where she'd carved marks years ago. 40 marks in the bark, never erased, never forgotten. "See these?" she said, her voice still strong despite white hair and weathered skin. 40 days I was buried alive in a hole in the ground. 40 days of darkness, hunger, suffering that should have killed me but didn't. You want to know why?" The young folks leaned in, listening hard. "Because I had ancestors walking with me. Because I had love pulling me forward. Because I understood that my suffering wasn't just about me. It was about all of us. Every soul who's ever been enslaved. Every person who's ever been buried alive by systems meant to break them. And I want you to remember this. No matter how dark it gets, no matter how deep they bury you, no matter how long the suffering lasts, you can survive. You can rise. You can burn down every chain and walk away into freedom." She pressed her palm to the tree, feeling the marks under her fingers. "Quem sofreu, sofreu. Quem resistiu, deixou memória. E memória a gente guarda aqui nos echoes from the quarters. We are the echoes of those who came before. We carry their strength, their wisdom, their refusal to be erased. And as long as we remember, as long as we tell the stories, as long as we pass down the truth, slavery may have tried to kill us, but it failed. We're still here, still free, still fighting. The young folks nodded, understanding settling into their bones. They touched the tree too, connecting themselves to Sarah's story, to the stories of all who'd suffered and survived, to the long chain of resistance that stretched back through centuries and would continue forward through generations. That night, Sarah lit a small fire at the center of the settlement. Not a fire of destruction this time, but a fire of memory, of celebration, of community. Folks gathered around and she told the story again. Her story, their story. The story of Sarah do POÇO, who was buried alive and rose again, who walked through fire and emerged free. And in the flames' reflection, if you looked close, you could almost see them. The ancestors, the spirits, the countless souls who'd walked this terrible path before, and who'd paved the way with their blood and their breath and their unbreakable will. They were smiling, those spirits. Smiling because Sarah had kept her promise, had survived, had fought, had freed herself and others, had become the story that would be told around fires for generations to come. She was Sarah do POÇO, Sarah of the well and the fire, and her story, our story, lives on. Who suffered, suffered. Who resisted, left memory, and memory we keep here in the echoes from the quarters. So remember, my people, remember Sarah. Remember all who survived the unsurvivable. Remember that even buried 40 days, the spirit rises. And when it does, it burns bright enough to light the way for all of us still searching for freedom.